Hello and welcome to the International Women's Day virtual conference and today's webinar, The Day-to-Day Realities of Navigating Gender Parity. My name is David Kelly and I am the Executive Director at the British Chamber of Commerce here in Singapore. Whilst the coronavirus has changed our plans to hold our annual International Women's Day lunch, important discussions around gender equality continue, and this year we bring a very special triple session International Women's Day virtual conference in its place. We hope that by continuing to think together, we can help accelerate the pace of gender balance in organisations and find a way forward. Over the next 7 days, we will bring 3 really interactive webinars with fantastic guest speakers who will open the floor to your questions and your perspectives. Later this week, we will hear from keynote speaker Danny Cotton, the former London Fire Commissioner. In 1988, the London Fire Brigade had 9,000 firefighters protecting the people of London, with just 40 of these being female. Danny joined as a new recruit facing these odds and spent the next 31 years climbing her way to eventually hold the most senior position of London's Fire Commissioner. And Danny has since been recognised with very many prestigious awards for her work in diversity, inclusion and leadership. So please do join us later this week for that. Our third webinar of the series is a conference on the 29th of September titled Quotas, a Blessing or a Curse, which promises to be a really interesting debate and a series of presentations from our formidable panel of speakers. In 2010, the UK spearled an initiative called the 30% Club, which seeks movement for gender-balanced boards. The idea of that being a quota appointment making a lot of people uneasy, but change at the top continues to be sluggish when left to develop under its own means. So please make sure you join us and have your say there as well. We make sure that you have joined us today using the Zoom application rather than via your browser. This is really important as we'll be using breakout rooms later in the session. So to get the most out of today's session, please do make sure that you've downloaded the Zoom application and you are using that rather than the browser application. Also, just a quick reminder, in terms of facilitating this, we are in meeting mode rather than webinar mode. So don't worry about it, but it just means it's a polite request just to keep yourselves muted during the main presentation segment, just to make sure there's no background noise and to enable our speakers to talk today. This fantastic conference would not have been possible without the support of our Women in Business Committee, who work extremely hard to keep these important topics at the forefront of our minds. During today's breakout session, you will meet some of these committee members who will facilitate and contribute to the conversation. So huge thank you to all of you for getting so involved. A final thank you to Barclays Bank, our diversity and inclusion partners whose support in all of our activity around this area allow us to deliver great events like this in this space. I would like to now introduce you to Luciana Vicchino, Asia Head of HR at Barclays Bank, and also the Chair of our Women in Business Committee, to say a few words. Luciana, really excited, and over to you.
Thanks a lot, David. I'm really happy to be here today. And thank you all for joining us today. It is really important to see so many of you taking the time from your busy calendars to join us for such a relevant conversation. And I have to say, the importance of actively pushing for a change in the corporate environment and society overall came very strongly to me after I took a literature course focused on female characters in romances of the 19th century. I have realized then that much of the society rules from that time are still applied to females in the 21st century. There was a very hard realization and something that we cannot continue to support. At Barclays, we have been focusing year over year, and as many of our colleagues in the financial industry and in other industries as well, to promote change and to allow an inclusive and diverse environment that respects gender balance. We have implemented gender-neutral primary care policies, promoted flexible working practices for females and for males the same. We have created groups of support for females by engaging strategic partners and also through employee networking groups. And we have implemented globally programs to support males and females to return to the workplace. We have seen a lot of progress, but it's still not enough, and the pace of change needs to accelerate. Promoting cultural change requires a lot of persistence, constant effort, and many open conversations to be effective and sustainable. So forums and events like the one today and the coming ones on our IWG series this year are extremely relevant, so we can review progress, share ideas, and commit to relevant change. Today, we'll hear from Liana Attard, who is a partner at Asia Zone Consulting Leader at Mercer and a very active member of our Women in Business Committee with BridgeM, and she'll talk about the day-to-day of navigating gender parity. I believe that many of the findings being shared today will be surprising to some of us. Following Liana's presentation, we'll organize this larger group into breakout rooms where we'll explore the role that employer and individuals can play across 3 key areas. So the first one is intersection of gender and age. The second, male perspective on role in promoting gender parity. And the third, caregiver, childcare, and education support. Each session will have a moderator to take the groups through the topics and promote meaningful conversations and sharing of experience and ideas. And we will then regroup as a larger group for a Q&A session with Liana and a summary of the breakout sessions. And let me stop there because Liana has a lot of interesting content to share with us today. So Liana, thanks a lot, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Luciana. Thank you for joining us today. I'm really pleased that you can all participate and also engage in such an important conversation. Today's webinar is an interactive one, so we will be inviting you, as you heard from Luciana, to join the conversation. So we're keen to hear from each of you during our breakout sessions. I'm going to kick off our discussion with some insights and trends from Mercer's When Women Thrive research. And this research is conducted in collaboration with the World Economic Forum. And for the first time since Mercer conducted this groundbreaking study 5 years ago and first published our very first report, our research actually shows that hiring, promotion, and retention rates for women are actually now comparable to those of men across all career levels. So this is a really significant achievement and shows what we can achieve when we tackle a challenge and also get real results. And organisations, as I'll share shortly, are really taking the necessary actions to make a difference, which is great. And they're doing this on a global scale, and we've seen some real traction, particularly in Asia Pacific. But for most organisations in real terms, reaching that mark that I've just talked about actually requires pushing past just hiring and retention and promotion, and actually requires perseverance over time. So it's really all hands on deck. We all need to be rowing together in the same direction, and we can certainly go together further and faster. So it's really a coordinated effort. As Luciana mentioned, we're going to be examining the role that organisations play, industries, communities, individuals, countries, to really move that needle and ensure there's equality of opportunity, experience, and also pay. And so with that, I'd like to share now some of the key findings from the When Women Thrive 2020 Global Report that was released in February this year on Let's Getting Real about equality, and just some examples of how companies are taking action and demonstrating that business action and the impact of that progress and the role that individuals can play too in the gender parity agenda. So we can move forward, please, to the next slide. The research, like I mentioned, was conducted in partnership with WEF, and it's one of the more comprehensive gender equality studies that are being conducted globally. So as you can see, this year we had nearly 1,200 companies participating, which represents 7 million employees. What's exciting for me is when we first launched this in 2014, we weren't able to conduct a regional cut of the Asia region in terms of the data results because we had so few participation. And I'm really pleased that fast forwarding 6 years on, we've seen a significant improvement in participation in the research itself and in the study from companies within Asia, showing the focus and the importance of this topic and of this conversation here around gender parity. So for those of you that haven't seen it already, the report is available on the BridgeM site, both the full report and the key findings, and I do encourage you to take a look and download it later. So before we dive into the specific results and trends, if we can move on to the next slide, I just wanted to spend a moment reflecting on the current global D&I environment. When we first started this research, many companies were just beginning to build that business case for why a diverse workforce was important, why we needed an inclusive culture. But now I think we can see that a lot of companies can say that that business case has been proven. It's there. And there's ample evidence showing that having a gender-based workforce can actually positively impact a business. So even though companies have been focused on improving gender balance, it hasn't been fast enough, unfortunately. And we're now seeing increasing and often intense pressure coming from multiple sources, which is why we've called this slide here the pressure cooker. So for example, there's been an increase in pressure in ESG investing, which focuses on diversity as a way for stakeholders to measure the social impact of their investments. Voluntary disclosure, where more progressive organisations are taking the lead in sharing their data internally and also externally to drive transparency. Shareholder activism, with organisations being challenged to reveal their medium gender pay gap. Regulations and quotas and pay equity mandates, and we're really seeing that in many markets, in particular in Europe and also the US. We haven't quite got there yet in Asia. And last but not least, the impact of COVID. And it's one that I do want to spend a little bit of time just talking about. If we can move to the next slide. I think it's one that we cannot ignore, and there's been quite a bit of debate already about the impact that COVID would have on gender parity. Are women at a further disadvantage, or will this actually positively impact change? I think by altering attitudes towards working from home, COVID has definitely changed further the way that we work. And according to a Mercer Pulse survey that we conducted globally in August, about half of those who were employed before the pandemic are now working remotely, with many organisations saying they're actually going to switch to doing this more permanently. So it's tempting to think that, you know, flexible work options like this are going to be a big equaliser for women. And many are daring to actually hope that removing the stigma to working from home and cutting down commuting time, for example, can actually add hours to the workday, and women can maintain a full-time job without losing traction in their career during their caregiving years, which is when we tend to see a lot of leakage in terms of women leaving the workforce. Having said that, we need to consider these three potential considerations I've got on this slide here, and it's interesting to see how this will play out as we move forward. The first is a work-family conflict. Recent research suggests that flexible working may actually increase that work-family conflict because it's likely to lead to an expansion of work and increased domestic burden on employees. And a recurring finding is that women are more likely to carry out those domestic responsibilities in terms of these gender-based roles while working flexibly, whereas men are more likely to prioritise and expand their working spheres. And women in general undertake, based on recent research, 4 times the amount of unpaid work compared to men. And this often hinders their freedom to choose to work for pay outside the home as well. So to free more women up to work for pay requires, for instance, expanding affordable childcare, improving household and transport infrastructure, deploying digital technologies, which we've definitely seen an advancement of more recently, and sharing unpaid work more equally between men and women through, for instance, policies promoting parental leave and flexible working, and implementing these in practice as well. Historically, company practices that increase flexibility with the aim of facilitating a better work-life balance have not necessarily resulted in an increased advancement of women to more senior levels. And this can be a breakdown in practice locally within an organisation. So the issue is that potentially the inequities that existed before perhaps could be amplified further, particularly in Asia. The access to informal networks and critical assignments is an interesting one. So even in work from home environments, women, even before we were doing that, were finding it hard to get the career benefits that come easily with networking, particularly after work or informally on the weekends. So the questions being asked now, will these work from home policies that we now have in place more broadly through COVID actually accelerate this underlying inequality, or will it actually help? Networks play a really important part in, allocating work assignments. It can transform managers into leaders. It exposes those to critical learning, access to projects. So it's a really critical part. So it'd be interesting to see how that plays out in a post-COVID world as well, as we continue to work from home. A new form of presenteeism is a really interesting one. We've heard that a lot of companies may shift to 100% remote work, and some companies have been really vocal about doing this, particularly in the tech space. And in most cases, some people will be physically co-located while others will continue to work remotely. So what happens when some team members are in the office or traveling for work and you've got the others working from home? Will we see a gender skew here, is the question that's being asked, with men disproportionately being in the office or on the road, you know, visibly contributing to the business, while women are out of sight and out of mind. So unless companies learn to evaluate output and rewarding people for what they actually contribute rather than for what they show, then we'll tend to see an imbalance there. And a world of mostly remote work may increase an organisation's bias for rewarding those who are present and disproportionately harming women. So if we can go on to the next slide, I think we've looked at, you know, some of the current realities, particularly in relation to COVID and some of the challenges, but also potentially opportunities too. So where to start is often the question, you know, what's going to be most impactful? What should we prioritise? And it's time that we start looking at diversity through a different lens. We currently look at it in terms of representation, and that really needs to change. We need to look at it in terms of equality of opportunity, equality of experience, and equality of pay. And ideally, we'd like to see organisations achieve a balanced workforce in all facets of diversity. And that's a really important long-term goal, but most organisations won't achieve it if they don't have a culture of inclusion. So in this sense, we're encouraging organisations to solve for equality of opportunity, experience, and pay. And this equality is what sets the foundation for longer-term results and to affect longer-term change. And it's a very different strategy than simply focusing on numbers or levels of representation. And this way, the way an organisation can actually drive inclusion is to hardwire programs, policies, processes to ensure that they support equality of opportunity, experience, and pay, as you see here. So let's get stuck into some of these results. The next key insight, if you go into the next slide, please, is of our research is that senior executives and board members, they are engaged in D&I efforts, but manager involvement is lacking and critical for creating an inclusive culture. And this is a really big shift that we've seen in the latest results of this research, vis-a-vis the last one that was conducted a couple of years ago. And it's really important to become a more diverse and inclusive organisation. Yes, we need commitment from the top, but that needs to translate into action at the manager level. And in fact, time and time again, that is a very important missing link that's driving more D&I outcomes within an organisation. And what I want to share now on the next slide is actually the first of the say-do gaps that we've identified in our research. So say-do is the gap between what organisations are saying they're doing versus what they're actually doing. 81% of respondents in our research said that they agreed or strongly agreed to improving D&I. However, when we asked them if they had a strategy in place for improving D&I, only 42% had one in place. The next part of the research, if you go to the next slide, is less optimistic. And this is around what I just mentioned, the involvement of middle managers and frontline managers. And this is particularly critical. Only half of companies report that their middle managers are involved in D&I activities, and only 46% of frontline managers are involved. So managers are critical in delivering on D&I objectives because they're ultimately responsible for the day-to-day interaction that they have with colleagues, people management, hiring, promotion, decisions, discussions around compensation, etc. with employees. So if we want companies to truly create an inclusive culture, this is an area that we need to move from getting the commitment at the top to bringing it down to the manager level. So this means training all managers to ensure that they can lead the organisation's D&I agenda. So for example, how do managers support employees with the uptake of flexible work options, which is particularly relevant now during COVID? We've seen in our research and work with organisations that women, and also men for that matter, are reluctant to use flexible work options if they don't feel that there's broader support within the organisation, and especially support from immediate managers. And this is a really great example where managers can make a big difference here. And then lastly, 48% of organisations report that men are involved in D&I. Now, this is a bright spot for us because it's 10 percentage points up from 2016, so from 4 years ago. But clearly, it's obviously still too low. Hence why we've got a breakout group on this as well. Given that men still hold the majority of leadership roles globally, it's critical to ensure that they too are aware and trained to support women in the organisation. And based on research done by one of our external partners, the issue isn't that men don't want to help deliver the D&I agenda. They're not sure what to do or how best to go about it. So on the next slide, I think the key insight of our research is around pay equity, which I did want to touch on. The good news is that companies are adopting a more disciplined approach of analysing pay equity. However, the global results show that remediation to this is lacking. So if we go to the next slide, there's a bright spot, and these are the Asia-specific cuts of the data, by the way. It shows that 66% of companies reported that pay equity is a part of their comp. For us, I mean, we're still lagging a little bit behind global. So just for comparison, globally, that number was 74% globally. But the other bit of good news is that for us here in Asia, about half are using a robust statistical approach. And this is a significant improvement from the last time that we ran the research. And probably not surprising given that we've seen a lot of legislation around the world in respect of pay equity. I know not yet in Asia, but for multinational organisations, they're filtering that down through the respective regions. So one key example here is around remediation is that 43% of companies report that they actually have a process in place for dealing with this. So what we're seeing with organisations that a lot of them are doing this pay equity analysis, which is great, but it's happening in private. So more progressive organisations are a little bit more transparent with their employees around pay itself and the way that they analyse the data, how regularly they do this, and the remediation processes in place for dealing with any inequities, which is awesome. And both HR and the C-suite are involved in pay equity, but only 26% of organisations in Asia reported that their board is engaged. So definitely an opportunity for improvement here. The next key insight on the next slide is, of our research is another say-do gap. And this relates to companies saying that women have equal opportunity for advancement, but the data is telling us otherwise. And this is what I want to share with you now. On the next slide, you can see that 79% of organisations say that women have equal access to roles that lead to advancement and leadership positions. Yet what we found here is that, as you can see on the right-hand side, only 52% say that women are equally represented in people management roles, and less than half, 44%, are actually in P&L roles. And only 41% of companies are actually tracking their data internally by business unit or geography. Also, interestingly, only 64% track gender representation by career level, and 58% track hiring, promotion, and exits. So this is another real say-do gap for us, because organisations who don't track the data, you don't know what's happening. So as these numbers reflect, a lot of companies are very optimistic that the women have equal access. But when you start to sort of look underneath the hood, so to speak, and ask some basic questions around, are you tracking gender representation by career level? Are you tracking hiring, promotion, or exits by gender? We see that there's a real opportunity for improvement there with many organisations. On the next slide, please, I want to talk a little bit about workplace flexibility, particularly relevant today, as we were talking about at the outset. And it's increasingly important for both men and women. And it continues to be especially critical for women since they play or predominantly fill caregiving roles, as we will talk about later, both for children and also other family members. And in our research, we also looked at flexibility and identified another say-do gap. 67% of organisations offer a variety of flexible work options. So this is not, by the way, working from home. Flexible work options is beyond that. It can be remote working, yes, but it could be how and where and what work is being done as well. So compressed work weeks, part-time schedules. However, only 49% of organisations value remote working as much as in-person working, and only 52% of leadership actually and actively promote the uptake of flexible work options. So I do want to share that this study was conducted at the latter part of last year, with the results being released in February. So that's relevant because this was all pre-COVID. So it'll be interesting to see how these results now shift and change post-COVID, or as we move into a new way of working. But I think this is still very telling around the gap between policies and actually practice being put into action. Next slide, we looked at part-time structures, and what we found is that the majority of organisations, so 62%, value people's contributions according to results and not the number of hours, which is great, but only 45% say that part-time employees have the same opportunities to advance as full-time employees. And this is a huge gap. And what we find, like I was saying earlier, is that companies offer practices and programs around flexible work arrangements, so that's a bright spot, but employees, both men and women, are not taking them up. And this oftentimes is because of cultural elements that are ingrained in the organisation and even in society as well. So it's critical here to train managers for them to support employees to utilise these benefits as well. And so lastly, the fourth point that I wanted to highlight, and this is the next key insight of our research, is frankly the most disappointing finding for us. Since 2016, we've seen very little progress around companies addressing the holistic needs of women related to their health, their financial wellness, and also their caregiving needs. Why is this so important? The vast majority of great work that's being done is being done to support women in the workplace, which is great, around careers and pay. And while we don't want to lose focus on these critical and important elements, we can't ignore the fact that everyday experience is equally informed by health and financial status. If women, and for that matter, men as well, are healthy and financially confident, they'll be more productive and successful at work. Yet this is an area where there continues to be very minimal progress, and even less so, this is globally, but even less so, unfortunately, in Asia. So just want to share a couple of slides on this point in terms of the findings. Yeah, thank you. You can see here, I've got a few stats shown on this slide. I'll just pick out the key ones, but 25% of companies look at the unique health needs by gender, and there has been zero progress on this in the last 4 years. And only 23% have conducted analysis to identify healthcare needs for late career workers. And the financial wellness numbers, which I'll touch on again in a moment, are the most dismal, with only 9% of organisations actually looking at their data by gender. And so for the first time, this year, we've focused on caregiving in our research, with 31% of organisations reporting that they gather information for employees regarding their needs. And we've seen that this is a significant gap for us in Asia. Whilst we have seen some traction around family-related benefits, more progressive organisations incorporating that into their benefit philosophy and strategy, it's still definitely an area for improvement. In the next slide, I wanted to highlight here a little bit of a deeper dive into Asia specifically. Gender-based roles are still very strong in Asia. 61% of women are taking a break from the workforce due to the birth of their child. Most countries have barriers to women rising to leadership roles in business, namely cultural expectations that women should prioritise childcare over their careers, and a lack of suitable or affordable childcare, unconscious bias in the workplace, and a lack of role models and also sponsors here. And perhaps critically, a failure for many companies is not flexible working options, but putting that into practice and upholding those as well. And we've really seen that probably more stark in certain markets in Asia than others. So for example, in Japan, we see, if you have a look at a traditional internal labour map, for example, you see a lot of leakage at that mid-level career point, where many who leave to start a family often do not return back to the workforce. And a number of these factors that I've just talked about around lack of affordable childcare or access to this, or restrictions around working hours, or even when childcare is available, play a huge part in this as well. So the business case for supporting and engaging women as mothers in the workplace is there, with higher retention rates linked to the provision of paid maternity leave and strong parental leave policies and practices linked to pay equity for women. And we're seeing that parental leave policies are becoming very common in Asia. However, the practice of employees availing themselves of this is still quite low. So unless we socially and culturally find it acceptable for a male to take the same parental leave as a female and support this, then that we're never going to affect change here. And I think that line manager support and the stigma attached to that is very critical. And then lastly, on the next slide, the financial wellness gap, which I touched on earlier, is another growing area of concern amongst women, particularly in Asia, with 2/3 of women surveyed by Mercer not feeling financially secure, and only 1/3 confident that they're financially secure to go through to retirement and beyond. And in a study that was conducted by Mercer in collaboration with the Tsao Foundation here in Singapore about a year ago or so, the extent of financial wellness really differed by profile or demographic across women in Southeast Asia. So regardless, this is really becoming increasingly an area where additional education, awareness and support is required. And there are studies and diagnostics being conducted to gain a better understanding of the savings and investment patterns and behaviours of both men and women in an organisation and what factors influence those patterns. And we are starting to see organisations tailoring and offering innovative retirement solutions, which is great, that are geared towards women's unique financial circumstances. So with gender-specific, personalised, curated communications to point employees to the programs that best fit their personal situation. So in summary, if you can move to the next slide, please. How do we make progress? You know, what are the steps that are required to move forward beyond the research and the trends that I've just shared with you now this afternoon? When we completed the initial research study back in 2016 or 2014, we concluded that for many companies to achieve a diverse workforce and an inclusive culture, they really needed to focus on these 6 things that you see on this screen here, and really focused on both the individual and also the organisation. And we call these our 6 Ps, and they're really the building blocks or drivers for an effective gender or D&I strategy. And when we take a look at the 2020 findings, some of the key highlights I've just shared with you now, we feel that these 6 Ps are still relevant today as they were 4 to 6 years ago. On the individual side, organisations need individuals who are passionate and who are personally committed to improving D&I. And our 2020 findings show that there is an increased focus at the top, which is amazing and really good traction vis-a-vis the last time we conducted the study. But we now need to bring this down to the frontline leadership and managers and ensure that they too are passionate about improving D&I and are also personally committed to making this happen and affect the culture. And we also need to ensure that these efforts persevere. So in case one leader or one manager leaves who is a champion of D&I, that the whole thing doesn't fall apart and will not impact the D&I focus of the organisation, but that it's actually ingrained in the culture itself. And then on the organisational side, you need proof, and you need to be able to ask the questions, is your strategy as an organisation built on robust workforce analytics and data to determine what is helping and what is hurting the process of women and underrepresented groups? Do you have the right processes in place to eliminate bias and ensure that equity exists? Do you have holistic programs in place that are not just a checkbox exercise, but are designed and executed to support the different segments of your employees? And are you supporting them holistically as well? So we encourage all organisations and also individuals to consider these elements when you're building and implementing a D&I strategy, as these really are the foundation for what we need to be solving for in terms of equality of opportunity, experience, and also pay as well.
We have seen a lot of interesting content being discussed in the separate breakout rooms. So let's move now to a summary of the rooms, starting with the intersection of gender and age. So I'll ask Sarah Anderson, who is the head of sustainability and internal communications at Aberdeen Standard Investments, to share with us a summary of the interesting topics that have been covered in the intersection of gender and age. Sarah?
Sure. Hi, everyone. So excuse me whilst I try and condense the wonderful comments that we've got through. I think the kind of main thing for us, though, whilst looking at age, was really within the age bracket, it's the culture that really plays a part in defining how, defining gender ultimately and how you respond to that. And it's very interesting from a Singapore perspective. I just want to start with the news article that came out on the 20th of September, that Singapore is embarking on a review of women's issues in a move towards greater gender equality. And I don't know if how many people saw this, but it's a government initiative to essentially change a deep mindset, as well as changing Singapore's cultural value system, in the belief that every boy and girl must now grow up imbibing the value of gender equality, and that they should be taught that girls and boys are treated equally and, very importantly, with respect. So something interesting just to feel, from a cultural perspective, how the government potentially feels gender parity is still perceived within the country. And again, from the various different organizations we came from, it's very much, we very much identify that gender parity is heavily dependent upon the sector. So some sectors and industries are really dominated, for example, in shipping, by one gender, and it's very hard, to potentially get a huge, conversation and understanding from various different, from the genders across the different levels. From my personal experience and within our group, we actually have gender parity within our organisation, and we have a good representation of senior women in leadership roles, but they don't want to champion the agenda, whether that's cultural or that's a personality mindset. It's quite an interesting thing to tackle, because we know across the financial services sector this is not the case. So whilst we completely recognise that they are in their roles as a result of being the best person for their job, they don't particularly want to be sort of shown as the role model of the female face. So is that ageism, or is that a personality thing? And back to kind of Liana's point around, we really need to inspire and motivate the middle managers to make sure that these inclusion initiatives don't just sit with the CEO and the senior leadership, who potentially are the more mature characters, that really we can, with the right people and the right voices, we can really shift the needle from a gender parity perspective. I'm just scrolling down. Let me have a look. Apologies. I think also there's now a lot more recruitment drives, especially in different sectors, around making sure that particular industries are more appealing from a gender perspective. We've talked about, I mentioned about shipping, but similarly in the finance sector, which is where I come from, hiring at a junior level. Many roadshows now for many companies are at universities to really reframe companies to be more attractive as an employer to women. And again, that also falls back in to the secondary school system. So I think with that, one further point is that, and this potentially is definitely from an age perspective. We recognise that organisations are very good at shouting about the good stuff. People, shout about when they are hitting their gender targets or their race statistics. But we really need to have those communities to help have these difficult conversations. And within those communities, we need different ages and different races and different genders represented. I personally feel this is probably more likely to be where management expects, you know, the younger generation, Gen Z, millennials to step up. And that clearly shows that, yeah, from an age perspective, we really need to use a younger audience to be more vocal and braver. And with that, I will hand over to the next group.
Thanks a lot, Sarah. Really interesting. The next group is, I'm going to call Victoria Garrett, who is the head of Residential Asia Pacific for Knight Frank in the region. So to talk a bit about the Mayo perspective and the role played in promoting gender parity. I'm very curious about this one because you cannot actually move the needle in changing society if a part of society is not directly involved. So Victoria, over to you.
Thank you very much, Luciana. So we've had several different discussion groups talking about this topic. One of the first questions we talked about was COVID and how working from home had affected that sort of gender balance and supporting work and children. And the different groups had very similar responses to this. And in terms of being a bit of a double-edged sword, being a working mum, that children can tend to gravitate towards the mother, but actually it was a good time for men to see all the sort of responsibilities you take with working, the children, the household and everything else, to try and balance that up a bit. The other thing that's been interesting has been the sort of flexible working practices. There's been a lot of discussion in the groups about if that's positive or negative, like Liana said, in terms of visibility, how people are networking. The group I was in also talked about when you are in the office, how groups network offline, perhaps going for lunch, going for drinks, how that sort of boys club can still exist, or even girls club in another way. So making sure that managers, and we touched on middle management as well as an area like Sarah did in terms of her topic, it's so important that middle management understands who their team are, how they're managing them, how they're helping them to progress. Another thing that came up was, we talked a lot about male dominated sectors as well, and how it's important these are setting ambitious targets, something they're trying to commit to in terms of sort of the gender parity and 50-50 in terms of gender in the workplace. One thing we also touched on was actually what we're seeing now. Well, one of the groups had two different perspectives on this. One was talking about focusing more on the graduates, getting females through, but another group also talked about the fact that actually we're getting more female graduates coming through now if you look at that demographic. But what we're seeing is women are not still rising right to the top, and why is that happening? And that comes back to middle management and making sure that women are being nurtured and promoted in terms of how they reach their goals. We talked about the stigma of flexible working, but also maternity and paternity leave. That's still a big issue. We touched on the fact that countries like Sweden have got this right in terms of male and female having equal paternity and maternity leave, and they seem to take it, but actually other countries, there's still this perception that the sort of mother gives birth and the father's there, but actually it's then down to the mother to do the maternity leave, and how it's important to take that stigma away, and actually for companies to promote the importance of men and women both having the opportunities to maternity and paternity leave. We also talked about unconscious bias. I think the most important thing is that actually a lot of people do not still understand that there is this unconscious bias that's taking place. And before we actually address that fully, we can't really drive forward the agenda. So it was put forward in the group that I was in that actually there should be, like you have training on certain topics every year that you have to do to keep up your credits and for the company to be seen to be diligent in terms of fraud and other bits and pieces, that actually there should be a module every year for all companies on unconscious bias and diversity in the workplace, so that everyone understands what's expected of them and what the company is trying to achieve. So not just a one-off drive where you might get an external person in, but every year the company is training new recruits and everybody on that journey. And also the gap between what you say you're going to do and what you're going to do, and as Liana said, backing that up with data. So it's all well and good for companies to say, yeah, we want to drive forward diversity, we're going to do X, Y, and Z, but what does that mean at the end of the year? What's been achieved, what's worked, what hasn't, and how can things be improved going forward? I think that's probably most of it from me. I'll pass back to you, Liana.
Thanks, Victoria. Really interesting. I think unconscious bias is a constant training, because you figure out bias, you work with them, you get new ones, you work with them again. So a single classroom training is never going to solve for that if we are not doing the exercise on a daily basis. But with that, and I'll pass it over to Batya Schumann, who is a partner at St. James Place, and our last representative of the work streams before we close the event, with a very important topic on caregiver, childcare, and education support. So Batya, what can you share with us?
Hi, thank you very much. So the feedback generally was very positive. However, women still are bearing the burden of the majority of the caregiver role. Now, during homeschooling, the feedback had been very different to now that when the kids are back at school. During homeschooling, there was significant pressure on parents who had to juggle the responsibilities of homeschooling, specifically if you had more than one or two children. Even the logistics of number of computers and most of the schoolwork required supervision. So there was a lot of pressure on parents during the homeschooling. However, now that the schools are back, the sentiment is much more positive. There's a lot more flexibility. There's that human element that people are actually finding positive. You may be on a conference call and you'll see a kid in the background jumping in, and it adds that human element, which people like. But one of the negatives that come up is lack of work-life balance. Now that people are working from home, you know, the mornings and the days and the evenings are all blurred, and people are constantly working. Very limited annual leave. So this is actually putting a lot of pressure, a bit of burnout, and specifically on parents, because even on the weekends, they don't have any downtime. It's actually harder when you've got kids. But what was interesting, and this is something that Sarah mentioned earlier, was culture. Culture is very important, and it doesn't really matter what policies are in place. So there were mixed views. Some companies do have policies. Some companies said that, some people said the policies need to be updated. But it really comes down to the culture and the expectations of the organization, and specifically the expectations of the line manager. So I think line managers have a very, very significant role to play in setting the expectations. An interesting point that came up was what is going to happen in the future when people can go back to work. And this is something that Liana mentioned on present, when some people want to go back and some people choose to stay at home. What will be the pressure then? And it was also very interesting that it came up in a few talks, in a few rooms, the role of the helper. So a lot of people have the expectation that, oh, well, you've got a helper, so you can come back to work. But some families don't have helpers, and some women would want to stay at home and enjoy this flexibility. So what will happen then? How will the policies be altered? And how will the companies accommodate for this going forward? So a lot of very good discussion, and we look forward to see what will happen in the future. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Batya. Very nice summary, and I liked very much what you raised in the end. When you mentioned the helper, I think in the end, how we're going to look at the future is not about what people need to do, but is also what they want to do. And if by doing what they want to do, they can be more focused, effective, and successful and happy, then why not? And I think there's a lot that we can look as we work with that. Thanks a lot for the 3 work streams leads. I know there was a lot of information coming through to summarize. Very interesting points and conversations, and the Women in Business Committee will keep working with those points so we can keep promoting relevant content to get back to the members and invite people from outside of the community also to hear and keep talking about that. Lots happening, very interesting discussions. Thank you very much all for participating, and with that I'll pass it back and to our host, David Kelly, to close the event for today. David.
Thank you so much, Luciana. Thank you. I've got so many takeaways from this session, and I'm going to be bugging all of my team in the morning because it was absolutely brilliant, really, really engaging and expertly chaired. So thank you so much. Thank you also so much to Liana as well for a fantastic presentation, really, really inspiring. And thank you also to you all for getting involved and creating such an interactive session. I thought the breakout rooms worked really, really well. So a hugely, hugely great event. Thank you so much. And that leads me to say that is the first of our three events through our International Women's Day programme. So please join us on Thursday at 5 o'clock for the next webinar of the conference with keynote speaker Danny Cotton, the former London Fire Commissioner, and then for the final webinar at 4:30 on the 29th of November on quotas, which I think will be a really, really good and crunchy conversation as well. A final huge thank you to our diversity and inclusion partners, Barclays Bank, for your continued support of the Chamber and for this important agenda. It's really very important. And thank you so much. And look forward to seeing you all on Thursday, of those that you can make it. I hope you all have a great evening, and thanks again for joining us.